So I'm here today with Larry Shallenberger from Sarah Reed, and we met in Yonkers, just north of New York, last month. Larry, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do? And
Yeah, I'm the Associate Vice President of Compliance at Sarah Reed Children's Center in Erie, Pennsylvania. And we're an older behavioral health agency. We're over 150 years old.
wow,
In our current state, we have a full continuum of services from residential to partial hospitalization to outpatient and then intensive behavioral health services.
wow, wow, that's amazing. How long have you been working there?
I was here in the 90s, and I was more with direct care. I'd left the agency for about 17 years, and I've been back for about the last 8, um, working compliance.
Nice. So we met at the Sanctuary Institute Network Days conference last month, and Sarah Reed is Sanctuary certified. That's right, isn't it?
Right.
Which is, and Sanctuary, for those that don't know, is a really comprehensive trauma-informed model that's like well respected internationally. Was developed in collaboration with Sandra Bloom, and helps organisations to embed trauma-informed care across the whole organisation and the culture, all the way down to direct support. So it's a beautiful model. But I heard you talk at the conference um, uh, just about how difficult the last few years have been for organisations and how we might actually journey towards healing. And was so helpful for me, Larry, because I spend a good amount of my time thinking about and working with organisations that are just so struggling. And a lot of the time it feels like post-pandemic trauma responses, for those, particularly for care organisations that didn't close and just kept on going all the way through. But you started your talk by telling this narrative of the last few years in the care and the education sector. I hadn't really heard it
Mhm.
told in that way before. I just wondered whether you could share some of those insights about
Yeah.
those things.
One that you mentioned sanctuary, and one of the unique parts of that trauma informed model is it doesn't just look at delivery of services to consumers, but
Mm,
it pays a lot of attention to the organizational model.
mm,
And because we know that there's parallel process that happen, the things that are happening on a staff level impact the clients and vice versa. And even, on a macro level beyond what happens at Sarah Reed, the ecology
yeah,
of what's happening around us, impacts the organization.
yeah,
And I think behavioral health organizations, all of us, we've weathered multiple traumas.
yeah,
When COVID hit in 2020, I actually became the compliance officer 3 weeks before the national emergency was declared, which was fantastic timing, right? So I didn't know the job as it normally would be, and now we're in emergency mode.
yeah,
So all of us, we were trying to keep our loved ones safe. The air that we breathe literally had the potential to be lethal. Um, so we're all heightened. I don't know what it was like in England, but over here there were days I would walk into the grocery store and there's no toilet paper. You would walk by the meat section, there's no meat. My breaking point was I went in and there was no kale, and I'm like, I know nobody else eats this stuff, right? It's just right. So we're going through that, and we're trying to keep our families healthy, and our ability to communicate and have community with each other was disrupted.
yeah,
You know, Prior to COVID in the agency, we couldn't figure out Zoom. It was a mystery. And our meetings were awkward, disjointed. And 6 months in, we're fluent with this. But it's just an example how everything changed. We had vaccine mandates that came in 2021,
yeah.
and that created a unique crisis because the government then created a line at who got to be out of the community and who didn't.
Yeah.
And then the fact that it was external and not an internal choice, it created a lot of disruption.
Yeah.
Um, right. And so then we move into 2021. So we're dealing with COVID, and now we're this new thing with the great resignation.
Yeah.
Now that we have the vaccines, um, jobs are returning to the workforce at a faster rate than people are.
Yeah.
And so that creates a shift now where the employee has the power. They get to choose. And behavioral health, because we're relying on government funding and fee for service, we couldn't keep up with those competitive wages, right? So wages are inflationary, the employees have the choice. So now organizations like ourselves, we're losing experience. So we have people um, that get trauma informed care that have 20 years of experience, they know how to interpret a situation accurately, and now they're gone.
Yeah.
They're able to work in private practice now, and do telehealth from home.
Yeah.
And they're safe and they don't have to commute and they get to set their own schedules that are getting paid more. And so we experience just trauma knowledge just walk out the door. And it takes time. We were having a conversation before we recorded about even trauma informed organizations
Yeah.
um, make mistakes. And a lot of that it happens when it you can join the organization, but it might take you 2 years before you intuitively interpret things in a trauma informed manner
Yeah.
before you start embodying the values and the core beliefs because it's not because society is not trauma informed, right? So we're dealing with the loss of experience, the loss of institutional memory, knowledge, experience, and we have a smaller workforce who's less confident and less able to respond to the needs of our clients. Um,
Yeah.
and then in 2020, I'm sorry, 2022, that only escalated further, right? So Russia invades the Ukraine, and now the price of oil goes up, food goes up, and so our workers need better wages that we're not able to provide, and so we're just not catching up and recovering as an agency. So cumulatively, we found ourselves over 4 years into this that
Yeah.
we're a trauma informed organization, but we're actually traumatized ourselves,
Yeah.
and you don't have an awareness of that when it happens. There's not a warning light that goes off in the dashboard. Um, you know what I mean? And we found ourselves, just like individuals experience trauma, organizations do.
Yeah.
And so to realize that we're not just the healers anymore, but we're fragmented and we're disjointed and we're embodying negative communication patterns internally. Um, you know what I mean? We found ourselves in a place that we did not aspire to be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you like walk us through those last few years. And I know something you mentioned in a conference that you haven't just mentioned as part of this story was, of course, the racial justice movement that happened in response to George
Oh,
Floyd as
yeah,
well.
that was yeah, that had a huge impact on all of us. I'm sorry I omitted that. So in February we have COVID. One of the impact is everybody's in their houses.
Yeah,
And in May of that year, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis by the police, and it was captured on a camera phone,
yeah,
and then sent into a nation where everybody's at home, they can't go out, and they're watching this live.
that's right.
And it exposed. It was a revealing of a reality that always was.
Yeah,
We talk about we use the word apocalypse. um, more we're thinking about like the future and the end, but in the ancient Near East, that word had a very specific meaning. It was a literary genre that was about an unveiling,
right.
right? And so it's using all those literary devices to talk about realities that were already in place. And I feel like globally, it was a revealing, right? So it reminded us that on top of everything else that we were dealing with, that our white privilege was built on systems of racial injustice,
That's right.
and continues to be sustained by that.
That's right.
And that had a huge impact on us organizationally, because we strive to be a very diverse organization,
Yeah.
but we found that different teams were more capable of processing that than others.
Mm.
I don't know if I got this detailed in the conference. Um, we have 5 units at our residential campus.
Mhm.
And 4 of those units, staff had the ability to talk very openly about what was going on.
Mm.
We had a lot of civil unrest at home, um, tens of thousands of people in the street protesting, and people were interpreting it differently. Is this, you know, civil disobedience? Is this good, or is this looting and anarchy? And that's a legitimate conversation that had to happen in the buildings where the staff could process that, regardless of their political beliefs.
Yeah.
They were able to talk to the children,
Mm.
right? And the kids were able to process it. We had one building where a leader held their political positions very rigidly,
Yeah.
and the staff didn't feel safe talking.
Right.
And because the staff couldn't talk about it, they couldn't talk about it with the children.
Right.
So that's an example of parallel process, right? Something happening out in society, it comes in and impacts the staff, and the way the staff react to that, it trickles down to the children.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And listening to you talk through those different situations again, I'm reminded about the level of power shifting that happens with each of those. You described how in COVID the power shifts to the government, and they make decisions on behalf of individuals in a way that we just weren't familiar with. And then, yeah, with the racial justice movement that came out of the murder of George Floyd, it wasn't a shifting of power; it was a revealing of power. And
Right.
and suddenly, yeah, everything looks different because they, like you say, that sort of apocalyptic revealing of reality, which shook, it shook people in different ways. We're still trying to work it out. And then that resignation, when you talked about the power shifting from the employer to the employee, and that like derailed everybody. And I think organizations are still reeling from that.
Oh, absolutely. We have not recovered from that.
No.
And so all those things happen at um, to us anyhow, happened at a rate more quickly than we could process,
Yeah,
right? And so it becomes trauma when we realized that we didn't return to our prior level of functioning.
that's right.
Our resiliency wasn't there as an organization.
Yeah.
Um, and then from there, um, to realize that we were in our own trauma spiral
Mm.
organizationally. And that's, that spiral, it starts when the organization realizes that it's been wounded. It's human nature as individuals or organizations to build that protective shell around yourself,
Mm.
and the defenses go up. And we experienced that, I think, internally, not intentionally,
Yeah.
but we had really good people that went through, in a residential treatment center, you can't shut down. You're there no matter what. Um, if you have enough staff, you're there. If you don't have enough staff, you're there, and you're doing the best you can.
Yeah.
But then you become frustrated, right? Because you need to have a narrative to help me understand why we don't have enough staff, right? And so it's possible for finger pointing to happen. What's HR doing?
Yeah.
What every HR department in the planet is doing, they're pulling their hair,
Yeah.
right? Because the employees don't exist. But in times of trauma, when we don't have a clear narrative, we generate one, and they're not always accurate.
Yeah.
So it starts out with the injury. We create the protection. We demonize people that are outside of the in group,
Yeah.
right? And then we idolize the people that are doing the real work,
Mm.
and we celebrate those things, right?
Yeah.
The thing that we found is as you endure that, and you have that circle the wagons mentality, you're not bringing in information from the outside,
Yeah.
and you lose the ability to look at your situation rationally.
Yeah.
Um, and then as you continue down that spiral, the next step is stress and anxiety become the normal filters that you see the work,
Yeah.
right? Because nobody's challenging perspective, right? And then from there, there's an identity erosion because in that hunkered down mentality, you're not valuing unity, you're valuing uniformity, right? Because one narrative emerges, and in a sanctuary environment, we value things like shared governance. You talked about the power shifting. Sanctuary organizations, we don't trust hierarchy, right? We try to flatten power structures wherever we see them. But when you're wounded, right, and you're anxious, you become defensive and you become controlling.
Yeah.
And then things like shared governance goes out the window.
Yeah.
Values like open communication. You can communicate openly to a point as long as you agree with the victim story, right? That narrative that we're, you know what I mean, but everyone's against us. We're going to do this anyhow.
Yeah.
And if you speak differently, right, it's not trusted.
Not
And
tolerable.
so when you weather, this continuing stress, continuing trauma organizationally, the danger of it becomes that you go inward,
Yeah.
you become anxious,
Yeah.
your sanctuary identity devolves and it becomes corrupted. We are the actual values of an organization or what you practice in times of stress, right? And so in those moments, you can have all the right, core values written on paper, we've got our 7 commitments, but you accidentally and suddenly you start swapping them out with control, defensiveness, right? And your organization or culture, the content of it changes and the emotional tenor of it changes. Then obviously at the bottom of the spiral, you know, stress and anxiety get replaced with anger and despair. And that's when you start seeing staff resign in sheets and board members dropping off. We haven't gotten to that point. But we realize that particularly at the residential unit, because they endure the brunt of it, right? These aren't bad people. These are people that did the hardest work. They had the hardest lift.
Yeah.
And it wore on them. It wore on us, right? They're none of them. It's an us. So we we're blessed. Our CEO, Dr. Dixon, she has been with us for 35 years. She built every program we have except for the residential unit. So she she has a clinician's eye, and she's all about family systems. And so it's just very natural to look at our organization that way.
Yeah.
And so the way when an injured group becomes closed, it's how do you soften that up? And so um, she arranged to bring in outside consultants to be in to talk to our staff about belonging and openness and what does it mean to be part of our community. A lot of listening groups. So you're looking at a slide right now that as we went through this, Dr. Fleming, who oversees our QAQI, she had her pre-doc interns. I believe it was 24 interviews with residential staff, and she just talked about obviously their identities weren't shared with leadership, and we just let them talk openly. And everything on this slide that's in the cloud, those are the emotional drivers that they were reporting to us. They were experiencing burnout from the long hours, having to pick up overtime shifts because we had inadequate staff. They're experiencing vicarious trauma. They felt unsafe. They didn't feel safe around the kids as they were becoming, aggressive because they weren't trained and they didn't know how to de-escalate. They didn't feel safe to share their honest opinions about what was going on. And then just compassion fatigue.
Yeah.
And those drivers, we got to, our staff are telling us this is what it feels like to work here.
Wow.
And then from there, through interviewing and then just our own observations, Dr. Fleming, she started categorizing our behaviors into themes. And so there was a sense of disconnection, between policy and process. We had policies that had been outdated and workflows that didn't work anymore in a post-pandemic environment, but they hadn't been updated, and it was creating frustration. I don't know what to do. We noticed people were disconnected relationally, and maybe even within themselves. We had more EAP referrals in the past 4 years than I think we've had in the past 20.
Wow.
Because the staff realized that they're understaffed, they felt undersupported, they weren't feeling prepared, they felt underpaid, they experienced inconsistency. We couldn't gather the staff for regular trainings during COVID, right? To get them in a room and have those team building experiences and to teach them processes. It was done one-on-one, it was done over Teams or Zoom, on the fly, and we realized it was hurting. The staff stress showed up with professionalism and communication. We value nonviolence, but communication would be harsh at times. They would feel a lack of follow through, that leaders would intend to do something and not deliver.
Yeah.
Probably because those leaders were overwhelmed as well.
Yeah.
Decreased open communication and counter aggression towards clients. And I know I'm putting all of our dirty laundry out there, but it's where we're at and emerging from. But
I was going to ask you, how did she get this data from? Was it through one-to-one interviews or group interviews?
It was one-to-one interviews.
That's fascinating to me because, like, sometimes I think when you've got this culture breaking out, if you try and gather this sort of information in groups, people, they just don't feel like they don't feel safe enough to share even amongst their peers.
Right. And I think, that's part of, I think, that trauma spiral we talked about,
Yeah.
right? So it took the one-on-one interviews.
Yeah.
And then Linda presented this to, the executive team, and we're like, okay, this feels right. And then to residential leadership. But then she and Dr. Dixon, they went and presented it to every one of the residential teams. And we asked staff, we heard you, we think this is what is going on. Does it fit? And then they affirmed it, right? So that going that way, once staff knew, we listened to them through the one-on-one interviews, and we Dr. Dixon and Dr. Fleming were able to create the safety. Then they were able to own it in a group setting.
Wow.
Right. And talk about a different reality than was safe before the process. So, and then from that point, the work has been to use what's on that screen. We've been using that as an action steps. So there's a lack of training. We lost leaders. So myself and the training director, we've done accelerated leadership development courses with an emphasis on emotional intelligent leadership and using sanctuary concepts to lead teams. Again, the retraining, we're working with the board to accelerate, staff raises to take stress up that way. It's we're looking at all of our policies and procedures to are they actually helpful in serving people that are trying to do a good job, right? So this has been I'm going to stop sharing, but the document has been something that's just been very beneficial to us. And
And
we
it takes
keep
a level
referring
of
to.
it takes a level of courage, not just to gather that information, but then to feed it back to the team and say, we know that this is how it is. And well, tell us, is this how have we got it right? And to be able to put back to them a picture of an organization that's that overwhelmed. And I guess that's incredibly important for that the staff feel heard and listened to. But it also takes some courage not to go into a place where you're justifying, or saying like, well, we know it's difficult, but we're doing our best, or not trying to like qualify it in any way.
Yeah, it's funny that you said that, because one of the consultant I mentioned that we brought in,
Yeah.
One of the staff's frustration is on the weekends at residential. You don't have all the clinicians available, leadership available, and they would have difficult weekends. And many of us would come in, and I used to work in residential. I know the work, so I could come in and help. And the CEO would come in. And there was one weekend where none of us were available to get there. And the narrative that came out of residential is, where's leadership? They don't care. It was kind of the unspoken. Well, it wasn't unspoken. It was very spoken.
Right.
There's that drive. There's part of me that felt, hey, wait a minute. That's not accurate, but perception is reality.
Yeah.
Right? It's king, and so it doesn't really. Being defensive wouldn't help.
No.
But the consultant, he was picking up on the staff that thought, and he goes, he just flat out said, they don't feel supported, and I don't want to hear about how many times you come on campus off hours.
Yeah.
And it was like a one-off remark, and it's against the rules, and I can't do it. But there is that thing where you want to defend your leadership.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't matter. I mean, it matters what you do, but it matters more if those efforts are being felt as help, right? And so that's one of those moments where you just have to kind of swallow and listen. And I'm blessed to be on a team where that's the expectation.
Wow. So yeah, well, thanks for. I mean, it's so vulnerable to share both not just the big process, but also how it played out for you as an organization. And I know that you've been working on putting a framework together to help to move towards healing. And I know that's still live. It's still work in progress. But you shared at the conference about the self model for organizational healing. And
we use the self model for everything. It's a nonlinear framework that helps you conceptualize the situation. So you could use it with a child, a parent, a family system, an organizational team. And the acronym, you start with safety. And so not just physical safety, but moral safety, social safety, psychological safety. So whatever the negative situation is, you invite people to look at that and assess it. The emotions, the emotional management. How is an individual doing? Identifying their own feelings and regulating them, but also being sensitive to the emotional state of others. Loss, obviously having an awareness of what the change costs the individual, the organization, and then back to future. So the framework was really easy in 2020 using it. So we would get to a point where there were mornings I would come and sit in front of this computer and I would have no idea what's next. Like, I don't know how to lead people. You know what I mean? So you would just get a big team of people. You would put that quadrant up. You go through the exercise, and then it helps you see the situation.
Okay.
Like, what are the safety needs that need to be addressed? What are people are feeling anxious, with COVID. So how do we manage that? The losses, obviously, community was a huge loss that we were constantly working on during that, and then helping folks figure out future and our situation with this. So one of the things I love about Sanctuary, and the most challenging things about Sanctuary, is it gives the concepts and it leaves it to you to operationalize it on your own, right? And so that's the blessing and the curse of the whole thing. Obviously, if it told you every step of the way, it couldn't adapt to the culture of unique families or organizations or where you put it on the planet. So it has to be, it's like opening an IKEA box with furniture pieces and having half of them missing and a note in the box saying, find supplies around your house and do it, right? And get the job done. That's the Sanctuary model.
Okay.
So I think that the challenge for us is like with safety, it's finding a way to help leaders operationalize it. So in the conference, we talked about using that TERRA acronym to help people assess. And so that's who's on my team.
Yeah.
See if I can do this from memory. So, when I'm in a new situation, right? It's human nature. We're just hardwired to view something unfamiliar as potentially dangerous.
Right. Yeah.
So when I'm in that new environment, I'm assessing the environment. Are the people around me are they for me or against me?
Right.
Right. And then expectation, can I predict what comes next? Or can't I? If I don't feel like I can predict the outcome, I'm ready to become more unsafe and more reactive and more agitated.
Yeah.
The R in the acronym reminds me to pay attention to rank. So we're getting back to power differentials.
Yeah.
And that's just not just organizational hierarchy. That could be power differentials around race or gender or sexual expression. And so the people that I'm leading, do they feel safe around me?
Yeah.
Right? I'm a middle-aged old white male, and that means different things to different people, and I have to be mindful of that. So how do I if people are feeling unsafe around me, how do I flatten it? And then agency, do I have any control in the situation or don't I? Right. So we've been using that in-house to help our managers, whatever the issue that they're looking at. Right. Because when you're dealing with humans and teams, you can never go wrong with starting with safety.
Yeah.
Helping people feel more secure. Right. And using the self model, we took that emotional spiral. And then that slide that I put up that Dr. Fleming developed, that really captured the emotional snapshot of where that one program was. Right. And so that was, and once people feel heard, seen, right, then we can have those conversations. The hardest part with when you're dealing with nice people, nobody wants to say it.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody wants to put it out there.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Fleming, she came up with a unique to us tool that captured where we're at. Then the loss. This is something we're still working on. At the beginning of this conversation, I kind of walked through everyone's last 4 years.
Yeah.
And it's impactful when you do that. But we sat in a leadership room probably 3 months ago and we've never processed this as a whole agency. Right. So it's not enough for the executive team to have a sense of it, but we've got to help the rest of the agency grieve.
Yeah.
Because they're already grieving, but they don't know that we're grieving.
Yeah.
Right. So it's how do we create spaces where people can.
Yeah.
Right. And then the future piece, this is how do we integrate the suffering and the losses? How do we integrate that step by step and then learn lessons from it and get stronger from it? And so that's the piece that's ongoing.
Yeah, but and that's a whole piece of work, isn't it? But it's so helpful that you articulate, like, if you don't know where you've come from and you don't know where you are, then you can't work out where you're going and what that future might look like. But by telling both the big macro story and also your own story of the organization, this is what we've been through, and then also this is how it feels to be here right now, then then we start to create enough safety to actually manage the sort of future safety of this is realistically how, you know, where we're going. We're going into we're going to continue to navigate healing from this and recovering from this, and we're going to integrate just as you say, integrate that suffering. So I think otherwise organizations tend to go into a kind of either they go into a fantastical space, like magical thinking, like we can just make this somehow magically disappear by maybe blaming people externally, or like you said, that sort of splitting where we're the heroes and the people outside are the villains, or just descend into a sense of hopelessness and despair where we cannot even conceive of a future because we don't have the rest of the story to build it onto.
Right. And so putting this in a story narrative is very helpful.
Yeah.
In the workshop, I used a quote from Donald Miller. He's one of my favorite authors. He wrote a book, A Million Miles in a Thousand Years. And in the book, he defines story as a hero who wants something and overcomes an obstacle to get it. Right. And so as organizations, we have to go back to the origin of who is the organization? So you go back to the origin story.
Yeah.
In our case, Sarah Reed Children's Center was founded in 1871. There was a woman in town, her name was Sarah Reed, and she banded together 30 other women, and they founded this organization. It was actually, at the time, it was we were the home of the friendless, which would not pass any branding tests now. I've tried it suggestively, we're not going back. And it actually became two organizations. In the 80s, it's split. There's a retirement center and there's the children's center. But when you look at the origin story, we were formed 5 years after our Civil War. And so it was a time nationally where, over the whole race issue and the issue of slavery, the nation was very divided. It was very charged. Sarah Reed and the people who founded us, these women didn't have the right to vote yet. And yet they banded together to create an organization that's lasted over 150 years. Yeah. So in our DNA, we have marginalized people founded the organization to serve the marginal and the vulnerable. And so we have to attach that. Right? That's our story. And we work best when we hold on to diversity. Yeah. Right. Because that's ingrained in how we started. So that's the hero. The obstacle became the last 4 years. Yeah. Right. And so we have to tell the story of, not that we have gotten through this. I think our story today is that we're getting through this. Yeah. Right. I think we're through the worst of it. Yeah. Right. The fact that we understand it is half the battle. Yeah. Right. And so the rest of it is just, I don't know when we're going to say that we're through this. It'll be when after the last conversation that needs to be had is had. Yeah. Right. If it takes a year or 2 years, I've given up putting a date on it. But whenever we get there, then it takes us back to the origin story. What did Sarah and those 30 women want? Yeah. They wanted to serve the marginalized and the vulnerable. That's what we want. And we got to this hurdle. It's made us stronger. And now we can recommit ourselves to that. And everybody that we serve has gone through the same trauma. Yeah. Right. So we're traumatized and we're trauma informed. And that gives us an authority, right, and credibility to do the work. Yeah. And so that's where I think the power of narrative comes in. Wow. Right. And so it's admitting we haven't gotten to the last chapter, but we're pushing there. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's so helpful. And I think as well, even hearing you talk through the narrative of
you know, of where you've come from, even right back to origin story, and then more recently, the last few years, it settles easily, doesn't it? It settles easy into my mind, the idea that the story that you haven't written yet, but that is coming, like your future, is not, it's not one dimensional, and it's not going to be simple, but there's going to be complexities to it. But there is a narrative arc which is about overcoming, that you're committed to, and you know you can do it because that's who you are, that's how you started. And even the idea that Sarah Reed's and her the team of women around her built the organization out of the Civil War, you get the sense of them building not because things were going well, but in a place of adversity, almost out of adversity, out of struggle, out of conflict, that like they built something. And so continuing to return to that, it builds an internal resilience, isn't it? Both like personally and into the organization, that this is very difficult. You know, the work you're doing is very difficult, but it is manageable. It's doable, and you have what you have in the internal resources to get where you need to get to.
Right. And I think that's part of having that optimism.
Yeah.
Is not easy. And I think all of the leaders, we've all had our moments.
Yeah.
Right. But when you attach struggle to narrative, it becomes discernible. It makes sense.
Yeah, it
But
does.
one of the things that I left out, the original band that started this, they led the organization through the Spanish flu epidemic.
Wow.
They wrote nothing about it. There's not a stitch of anything. And I would be fascinated to know what they did. And I mean, there was no compliance back then. There was no CDC or anything like that. They slogged through it somehow. And I'm sure that impacted them back then. But it never rose to a level of importance where they felt the need to document it.
But it has so many parallels, doesn't it? Because there's loads of evidence that we know that people covered their faces during the Spanish flu.
Right.
That whole, you know, with all of the implications of that, where your half of your communicative system, your facial expression is gone once you start, and that they would have gone through that as well, and all of the social and community implications of that. That's extraordinary.
And it never rose to the level of importance that
they wrote about.
We have a lot of history, and they didn't give us one sentence about it, which I think is remarkable.
Yeah, that is.
We've all found this so hard.
Yeah, we have.
And they apparently did it on the backstroke.
Yeah, I mean, either that or they just repressed it.
Either one. So that's an option we haven't considered.
Who could blame them?
Right.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's just so insightful to hear you talk about that whole process, and some of the tools that you're using to identify the problem, to like listen to your organization, and then together to map the ways forward. So thanks so much for sharing it, Larry.
Thanks for having me.